There are glasses that way.
Welcome.
Are we supposed to sit somewhere?
Yes.
Anywhere?
Carl in the middle. Marc there. Can you hear me? Is it on?
No, but we can hear you anyhow.
Okay. Welcome to this afternoon's session on enlargement entitled Rethinking the Enlargement Paradigm. Or perhaps it should be a question, do we need to rethink the enlargement paradigm? I think many people in this room would agree with me, and I think the panelists would agree, that the enlargement of the EU and NATO is seen as a tremendous historical success. One of the great projects that America and Europe worked on in the 1990s, and something that has changed the map of Europe for the better. But at the same time, if we look at the debate, we see that the debate in the West is changing. We have what we call enlargement fatigue, questioning about whether this process should continue, how it should continue. We have a new set of candidates further east, which are a little bit more interesting, complicated perhaps than their predecessors. And we have a different Russia, which is even more adamant than it was a decade ago in its opposition to enlargement. We have, to discuss these issues today, the Foreign Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, the former Foreign Minister of Romania and current candidate for the Prime Minister in Romania, Mircea Geoana, Marc Riekstins, the Foreign Minister of Latvia, and Marc Grossman, former Undersecretary of State from the United States. Carl, the first question goes to you, which is, you sit in the EU Council. You are a leading European politician and spokesperson on the enlargement issue. Do you feel enlargement fatigue, and do you think there is this need for a new strategic narrative for why enlargement is still important and why Europeans in particular should still support it?
Well, starting with enlargement fatigue, to a certain extent, that is a phenomenon that is there. That's not new. I mean, if you go through every single enlargement that has been there, from the EU of the 6 to the EU of the, 9, 12, 15, 27, it's always been a process where there's been sort of a lot of people skeptical. Is this a wise thing to do? Then the thing has happened, and people have said, yeah, on the balance it was a good thing, and after some time it was an extremely good thing. And then there's some hesitancy before one moves into the next stage. That's always been the case. I mean, some people still think that bringing in Britain was probably a mistake, and there were people who voted against Sweden in the European Parliament. So there's always been that hesitancy. Now, the 10, the Baltic and Central Europe, is not only, as you say, a success. I would say it is the great success of Europe during the last 10, 15 years. It is really what has laid the foundation for a new European renaissance in terms of peace and prosperity. When we go beyond that, we encounter, of course, areas that are somewhat different. With the Baltics and the Central Europeans, we're dealing with the countries that were just beyond the Iron Curtain, just beyond that famous line between Trieste and Stettin, cities that looked like more or less like our cities, if we look at it from the postcard version of geopolitics. When we move into the Balkans, it's different. When we move into Turkey, it's different. When we move into, say, the Ukraine, it is different. And accordingly, I think we need to have more of a profound discussion and a new strategic rationale for doing it. For me, it's obvious. It is about the peace and prosperity. As long as we haven't brought in firmly and secured a stable direction for countries like the Ukraine, Turkey, Serbia, to take 3 swing states in important parts of Europe, there is an element of uncertainty in the overall European situation that could come back and haunt us at some period in the future, and thus possibly also threaten to unravel what we've already achieved.
Mircea Geoana, in less than 3 weeks, as we heard from Secretary General Scheffer, Bucharest will be hosting the next NATO summit. Enlargement, it'll be a major issue for that summit, the so-called Adriatic III, but the rest of the Balkans and the question of map for Georgia and Ukraine. You were one of the first foreign ministers who at the end of the 1990s said NATO enlargement cannot stop with Romania, cannot stop on the western edge of the Black Sea, has to go across the Black Sea to the eastern edge to countries like Georgia and go north to countries like Ukraine. When you go to Paris, when you go to Berlin and London, and you have to make that argument, as well as to Washington, as you have been many times, convincing some of us that this was the next logical step. How do you make that case, and what do you say to Europeans who are perhaps a bit more skeptical? And how much success do you think you've had, or other people like you have had, who are part of the last wave of enlargement, now trying to make the case that it has to continue?
Listen, I remember that when we were talking about getting 7 new members in Prague, and I was starting together with you and other friends to speak about that, people said we should be nuts to believe that we can really swallow 7 new members from the Baltic to the Black Sea, as President Bush has put it in the famous Warsaw speech. So what we are doing now in Bucharest, we are doing a small piece of what needs to be done. The Adriatic III, I hope that the Macedonian name should be somehow addressed. It will be a pity for this country not to join. But I firmly believe that Bucharest should be not just a Adriatic III summit, should be also be a clear commitment for future enlargement towards Georgia, towards Ukraine, of course, if these countries and peoples really want that. What I believe would be different from the previous rounds of enlargement, where NATO went first and EU followed. NATO went first and EU followed. I think the time has come for us, and probably the Berlin summit in 2009, when the stars, the constellation will hopefully fall into place. With EU elections, with American elections, with EU-US coordination better. I think the time has come to accept that in the future, EU might come first and NATO afterwards, in some cases. I believe that for Georgia, NATO will come first, irrespective of the timing of that situation. For Ukraine, it might be different. Of course, Turkey, as Foreign Minister Bildt said, it is, I think, the grand bargain will be if the French are coming into the NATO military structure back, which will be a major, major change in the atmosphere and the relationship within the transatlantic community. I think Paris should lift its observations against Turkey EU membership. So when I go and hopefully talk to leaders in Europe and in the new American administration, I will make first the moral case. I see Sasha Vondra there in the corner. I see lots of friends that have started this journey 15 years ago when nobody believed that NATO will ever enlarge and EU will ever enlarge. That we have a moral obligation to fulfill the dream of a Europe whole and free. I will also advise my friends and our friends in Europe not to start again with Ostpolitik in Berlin, la politique orientale in Paris, with I don't know what in Rome, what else in Bucharest or in Warsaw. So the time has come for us to really engage Russia in a more comprehensive way, engage Russia with a capital E, as Jaap de Hoofdscheffer had said. But I do believe that we'll never be able to say a country cannot join just because somebody else has a potential veto. And the last point, I do not believe that we should really avoid the difficult discussion in Europe about money and the cost of enlargement, especially of the EU. Europe works for the American friends into financial perspectives, budgetary perspectives of 7 years. 2014 is the end of the current budgetary exercise in the Union. So if I would go to speak to the German Chancellor or to the French President or to anybody else, or to commissioners like Olli Rehn and the others, or Barroso in the Commission, I will start planning what kind of enlargement we should have for the European Union. And the last point, I think for the Balkan region or for the Balkan sub-region would be dangerous to have one country which is far advanced, like Croatia, probably also joining the EU, not only NATO in the next few weeks. That's great news, and we welcome that. And to leave Serbia with none. I think this will be a certain slight disbalance at the micro-regional level, and I think we have to make all the efforts in the world. And I would mention something, even if the Serbs decide something else on the elections that they have right now, because I don't believe we can really play with that bullet twice for the presidential race and now with the parliamentary snap elections in Belgrade. So to cut it short, nobody believed that Romania will make it. I can tell you that other countries will make it, and the journey is far from being over.
And do you think the journey in the decade ahead is going to be harder than it was for you and your colleagues and your neighbors in the 90s?
Will be much harder, of course, also because of not only because of the fact that there are countries that have not witnessed democracy for 70 years. We have not witnessed democracy for 45 years, and it's still difficult for us. Not only because the density of the strategic problems are increasing as we go further east, but I also believe that, speaking of NATO global partners in the future, I think one country we should engage energetically with is India. I believe that as we go into the greater Middle East, we'll discover new potential partnerships with Russia. So I believe that in a certain way it's more difficult. In a different sense, as we go into the great tectonic place of the planet for the 21st century, it might be easier because there are smaller pieces into the broader architecture of global security of the 21st century.
Marc Riekstins, Latvia, the Baltic states more generally, in some ways you were the Cinderella story of the 1990s. The small countries that no one thought could make it, who did make it, and are in many ways models of success, of reform. I know that your success has inspired many of the countries we're talking about today. We have Ukrainians and Georgians sitting in the audience here, and many of my Georgian friends have said to me it was only after you got in that they really truly started to believe that they too could aspire to join NATO. They didn't really believe it was possible, but your success made them lift their own aspirations and to really start working hard to fulfill the same goal for their countries. But you also know what it was like to sit outside the door, not knowing what was happening on the other side, living with that messy Western debate, which is a little bit similar to the messy Western debate we have today about Georgia and Ukraine, about whether they're really part of Europe, whether they're really democratic, whether they really qualify, whether we really are able to step up and not listen to the Russians or push back on Russian complaints and do this. What is your advice to our Ukrainian and Georgian friends here in the audience and perhaps listening to Brussels Forum about how to deal with that sometimes complicated, sometimes messy, sometimes ambiguous Western debate about the future of enlargement?
Well, Ron, I think that I'm in this context talking about enlargement of NATO and European Union. I'm in somewhat privileged situation because really I do know how it is to be at the doorsteps of those organizations. And now when we are participating in internal debates within those organizations about the future ways, about our responsibility, it's much more easy for me to understand the expectations of our Georgian, Ukrainian friends, our friends in Balkan region and elsewhere. I think, as you mentioned, we are, or we might be a good source of inspiration for those countries, a source of inspiration for very practical reasons, how to reform your societies, how to reform your military structures, how to establish a public dialogue with different groups of our societies. But also it is a source of inspirations in a sense that we have demonstrated that really there is a possibility to overcome some stigmas, like it was in case of Baltic states, that we will never get into the NATO. When we have raised this possibility in mid of 90s, I think the majority of our European friends, they diplomatically saying they raised their eyebrows. They at that stage they didn't believe that we will succeed, but we succeeded. But I think on more practical nature, I think that we can advise our friends in Georgia and Ukraine that first of all stay on message, be consistent, try to be even better than everyone expects you to be, and that was our approach in early years of our process of integration into European Union and NATO. That there were people saying that they have these concerns and those concerns, and what's about democratic institutions, what's about the rules of free market economy. And we have set our target that we have to be in our reforms better than everyone expects us to be. So in doing so, you can take away any argument any argument which might lead to the negative decision, be it in European Council or NATO summit. But at the same time, I would like to stress here that we should not underestimate the importance of the wording what we are putting into those documents. Not underestimate how the countries in waiting room are following so closely every and single word what we are writing down in those papers, because I think that they consider this question in a very simple way. Are we accepted or are we rejected as a potential members of those two important organizations? I think that there is no middle way. And when I hear today that there are ideas about thinking of new titles for action plans or whatever, I think don't fool ourselves. I mean, the rules have been set a number of years ago, and if we are going to change those rules during the game, then we will lose our credibility, and we have to avoid that.
One just follow-up question. If I heard you right, and if I were to ask you, again, talking to our friends in the Balkans, Ukraine, Georgia, elsewhere, who may be aspiring to join NATO, the single most important lesson you draw from your experience, or the 2 or 3 lessons, one is perform.
Yes, because this is performance-based process. This is performance-based process. From one hand, there should be very credible open-door policy from those two organizations. And the second very important principle is that this is performance-based process. If we are going to adopt new members only due to political considerations, then I'm afraid we can fail.
Marc Grossman, you had the pleasure of working on both rounds of post-Cold War enlargement, the class of '97, as I call them, and the class of 2002, in 2 different American administrations, President Clinton and President Bush. I think you know, and I think all of us know, that enlargement only happened with the United States playing an active, if not key, leadership role, and by laying out this bigger strategic framework that allowed us to enlarge, to simultaneously reach out to Russia and to pull this all together. But there are doubts today among some about whether the United States, after September 11th, facing Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, all the problems we've been talking about this forum, do you think the United States has the energy, patience, and the commitment to make this a priority for another decade? Because I think basically it took a decade to do the Baltic to the Black Sea vision, and the countries we're talking about today probably will be a decade before this gets done as well. Do you think the United States can do it again?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I recognize I'm a poor substitute for Senator Voinovich, but there we are. My answer to your question is yes, I do think the United States can manage that task. And the reason I say that really is threefold. First, I think it's worth emphasizing 2 points that all of the colleagues have made, no doubt better than I will. First of all, that I do think it's worthwhile for us to stop, and you mentioned it, and you all mentioned it. It's worthwhile stopping just for a moment, and again emphasizing the importance to the strategic viability of all of our countries of enlargement, both NATO enlargement and EU enlargement. And sometimes I think we just kind of pass by too quickly, and we ought to stop just for a moment. And I think this is especially true of Europeans, and recognize what an astonishing strategic success enlargement has been, and the astonishing strategic success that enlargement will be in the future. And that is worth emphasizing, I believe, over and over again, because as we consider what to do next, we need to consider what lessons we've learned from the past. And that lesson, I believe, is that these are very successful policies. Second, I just want to say to Mr. Geoana, I agree also in terms of the emphasis of the moral argument here. And that is to go back to the idea, as you did, that there needs to be a recommitment to a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And if we can recommit ourselves to these principles, whole, free, and at peace, I think it leads to the strategic conversation that you are asking me about. And so that's why I say 3, yes, I do think the United States is still capable of generating this interest. And I would say to you with respect that it is post 9/11 that makes it even more important that we do so. And when you say that I had the good fortune, and it was the good fortune, to be involved in both classes of expansion, the important part of the second class of expansion was that it had to do with the response to 9/11. And when I think about the agenda that is out there today, and we heard a little bit about it discussed yesterday in the session with the BBC, there's Afghanistan, and there's energy security, and there's counterterrorism, and there's climate change. It seems to me every single one of those new issues is relevant to NATO. It's relevant to the European Union. It's relevant to the transatlantic relationship. And as the United States considers how to deal with all those issues, I can't imagine that it will deal with them any other way than through these institutions. And I think that was part of the message of the Secretary General. Final point. I believe that any president who takes the oath of office on the 20th of January 2009, a little bit like Jim Steinberg said this morning, any president who takes the oath of office will be dealing with these issues. We'll be looking for allies and friends. We'll be looking for these multilateral institutions. We'll be looking for a way to manage the security questions after 9/11. And so I believe the United States is not just capable of considering this in a strategic concept, but also working hard to make sure that it's successful.
Final question on Russia. As you know, part of the strategy of the 90s was, as we were opening NATO's door to the east, we're also reaching out to a Russia that we thought was moving or wanted to move west as well. President Bush did the same thing after 2001, class of 2002. Today, we're less clear which way Russia is going, whether it wants to be part of the West. It seems even more adamant in its opposition to NATO enlargement as we are talking about countries closer to its borders. Yesterday, I think in that chair, you heard Konstantin Kosachev, who maybe is here. Konstantin, if you're here, let me know. Okay, good. He said Russia did consider itself to be part of this community of Western values. Do you think we need a different approach to Russia for a future round of enlargement, EU and NATO?
Well, I'd say three things. First, again, I was very taken with the points that you made, sir, yesterday. And I thought the idea that here was a Russia that was interested in the rule of law, the environment, fighting terrorism, global warming, climate change, all of these things seem to me positive. So the first thing I would say is that we need to kind of lift up the agenda, as we began to talk about yesterday. And if we're talking about those issues, I think that we can engage Russia in a positive conversation. The Secretary General just talked about also the possibilities in Afghanistan itself, for example, in counter narcotics or perhaps in some non-military support. Second, if we're prepared to do that, then, as the Secretary General said, the engagement, capital E, seems to me the obvious way forward. And if we were talking to this Russia that is interested, capable of being part of the world stage again on the big issues, then it seems to me we might be able to put into better context some of the other issues like enlargement. And I just agree with all of my colleagues here that NATO will enlarge as NATO decides to enlarge, but I think surely there's a way to enlarge this conversation with Russia so that this isn't the only thing people are talking about, and both Russians and Americans and our transatlantic allies see it in a larger context.
Okay. Several people have commented about this panel that we have 4 people up here who are pro-enlargement, and that we not really have the full debate. So I'm going to go to the audience earlier and try to bring in a diversity of views. In addition to letting you ask questions, I'm also going to pick on 1 or 2 people who I want to get specific national views into this debate. And Eckert's looking at me because he knows I'm going to pick on him or suspects as much. If Senator Voinovich had been here, the question I was going to ask Senator Voinovich, Eckert, is I testified last week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Enlargement. And what was striking to me was that from left to right across the committee, you had a unanimous view that we needed to do map for Georgia and Ukraine at Bucharest, in addition to A3, although there were some questions about A3, about qualifications and credentials, but let's leave those aside. I was recently talking to someone in your country's foreign ministry and asked, what was the view of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the German Bundestag? And this person said to me, you couldn't find a person in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the German Bundestag that supports map to Ukraine and Georgia today. Now, for those of us who know the 1990s, we know that it was the closest possible cooperation between Germany and the United States that made NATO enlargement possible. It was the cornerstone around which this consensus and strategy was built. Do you think America and Germany are on different wavelengths when it comes to the future of enlargement? Do you think these differences are overstated? if we have different views, why do you think we have different views? And Marcus, if you think you're going to get away without being asked something, don't fool yourself. So, but I'll start with Eckhard von Claden from the German Bundestag.
Thank
I've
you,
got
Ron.
all my Germans right here in front of me, so I can.
Yeah, we are a bunch. First of all, I think the differences are overstated. And the reasons within the Foreign Affairs Committee in Germany are different, of course, why we think today a membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine is not the right thing. And from my point of view, I would underline today, it is not a question of if, in my assessment, it's a question of when. And if we look, for instance, at Ukraine, we see that less than 30% of the population are for a NATO membership. And I think we should avoid a situation where a country comes into the map and leaves it. We had such events, for instance, with Malta, and this is something we should avoid. We also see that Yulia Tymoshenko in several meetings was quite reluctant. Even she has signed this letter, but she was quite reluctant on the map now in Bucharest. And so we think that the agreement in the Ukraine for a membership action plan should grow a little bit more, and maybe we should have it later. And regarding Georgia, I would say we have to look at the frozen conflicts. And to say it very, very shortly, we don't want to have another Cyprus within NATO. Where we have differences, also in our internal German debate, is the role of Russia. And my personal view is that there cannot be a Russian veto on that. So if these countries are ready for a membership action plan, they should get it, even if Russia would be against it.
Great. And Eckhard von Claden is on the Russian Night Owl this evening, so you'll hear more about his personal views about Russia after dinner. So first to Muri. I'm sorry, you all have to introduce yourselves. I know you all by first name, but maybe not everyone else in this audience does. And then Alina.
My name is Temuri Yakubashvili. Actually, I want
and you can actually ask a question of the panelists in addition to letting us know what your view is.
Probably the rare exception that I'm not going to ask the question but challenge the German delegation. Because what I heard now, it's a little bit contradictory, because if you say that you link Georgia's map to frozen conflicts, then that's what I call giving veto rights to Russia. Very simple. You are just repeating what Putin said. And it's very unfortunate if you would link it to something else. I don't know, level of democracy in Georgia, or, stars are not right and time is not right. And you say that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So do you have any magic stick that we will solve these territorial problems or frozen conflicts by next year, and how? And I believe that, giving to Georgia a membership action plan is a very significant way forward to solving these problems in a peaceful way. And if you put it ahead of the carriage of Georgian drive to NATO, then you say that, it will never happen because you have these problems, and those problems will be always there because Russia is not interested to solve them because it doesn't want Georgia to join NATO.
Okay. Alina.
Thank you. Alina PPD, Hertie School of Governance and Romanian Academic Society. My question is actually to politicians from new member countries. We tend to speak of EU enlargement fatigue like it's just out of the lake of shape of old European member states. But in fact, there has been quite considerable developments in the last 2 years showing that there is some backsliding of East Central Europe. If you look at the Freedom House indicators for these countries, you can see that since accession started, Poland was downgraded 5 times, and Poland was one of the most advanced countries, a model for all of us. In the last year alone, in Latvia, in Romania, and in Slovenia, there have been attempts to restrict powers and actually close down the anti-corruption agencies which have been created at the request of the European Union as part of the conditionality for these countries. So I guess my question really is, don't you think that the best way in which we can help this new accession country is by substantially keeping the commitments we have done to the European Union? Or otherwise the disappointment with us will be paid precisely by the countries that we claim we want to help get in. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question and then come back to the panel. And if Eckert or you and any of your German colleagues want to jump in, just raise your hand. Hon.Mircea, maybe you can help us understand what your boss's position on NATO enlargement really is.
Yeah, my boss's position was and is consistent, and it's based on the coalition agreement, and we know how Germany respects what's written in the coalition agreements, which basically says, for the first time in the Ukrainian history, that this coalition in favor of Ukraine's NATO membership. My boss presided at the Cabinet of Ministers meeting, who unanimously voted for the governmental program where the membership action plan was put on the spot for the first time with the clarity that never existed before. And my boss is consistent in the performance-based principle that this year, and that was very different with the previous years, already in February, the NATO-Ukraine annual target plan has been approved by the government unanimously. So this is the performance-based. I don't know whether your doubts come from the Yulia Tymoshenko position. Maybe it's because there was just a very brief meeting with the Chancellor Merkel in Lisbon, and we are looking forward to see a full meeting when it will be a chance for the Prime Minister of Ukraine and the Chancellor of Germany to meet. But let me assure you that this is no contradiction between the Yulia Tymoshenko's view, the President's view, and it was clearly expressed in the letter signed on the January 11th. As far as the public opinion is concerned, it is true, it's less than 30%. The highest now is 25% who are in favor of Ukraine's NATO membership. But the map is not the membership today or tomorrow. The map is an opportunity to move in an ordered way to the membership. And when we know the example of other countries, where at the beginning of the process, in Lithuania it was 16%, in Slovakia less than 30%, but because of the political will that was clearly expressed, because of the delivery and the performance shown, the education happened, public education, and that was less conflictual than it was before. So nothing is impossible if there is a political will, and there is a political will that exists. So I don't think this is the arguments, tactical arguments. I think the real arguments are a strategic one, arguments of the substance. This is about independence, this is about freedom of choice, and this is what the Ukrainian citizens basically chosen when they voted this government in for the third time after the Orange Revolution gave it a chance to deliver on the promises. And one of the promises of the Orange Revolution was a sovereign Euro-Atlantic and European choice of Ukraine. There is a consistency, and we hope this consistency will find a positive response as soon as in the Bucharest. Thanks.
I'm going to come back to the panel now. There's a question to the representatives of Central and Eastern Europe, but Carl, I know you wanted to jump in. And when you listen to this debate, and I'm sure you listen to it also in the EU Council, not just in the NATO context.
Well, this is a NATO debate. We don't discuss those issues in the EU.
I know, but that hasn't prevented you from having views beforehand. So, no, but are these really tactical differences? Do we have a broader set of issues we need to wrestle with?
Well, I just want to jump in on the question of has there been a backsliding in Central Europe? Is there perception of such a thing? I don't think that perception is there, but I do think that if you were to go around the members of the European Parliament and ask them about the most recent round of enlargement, they would probably tend to say that Bulgaria and Romania were let in perhaps a year or two early. And, of course, we know that there are special mechanisms in place, because there is the feeling that they still have to do fairly substantial work on things like corruption and the rule of the law. and they are on a special watch list arrangement. And that has led to debate in the Council, and we did have a very extensive debate somewhat more than a year ago, December of 2006, when we forged a new consensus of enlargement, that there will be renewed emphasis on the quality of the implementation. I mean, the strategic rationale was clearly there for moving fairly fast, including Romania and Bulgaria, for reasons that are more familiar from the NATO debate than from the EU debate normally. But when we move forward, I think there will be a harder emphasis on actually not only taking the decisions on the laws and the legislations and the rules and the regulations, but actually implementing them and implementing them over a period of time. I think this is essentially something that's good, because this helps the transformation of these societies. And as we move into these societies that we are now discussing, they of course have a somewhat longer way to go. Accordingly, they need more help. They need more of this conditionality. But that conditionality will be applied perhaps with somewhat stricter rigor than what we saw in the last round of enlargement. Then I'm talking EU, which of course, if you compare with NATO, and I'm coming from a country that doesn't even have a membership action plan, not even intensified dialogue. So I'm not going to speak too much about that. But NATO relates to security sector reform. EU relates to reform of practically every single aspect of society, and including things like environmental standards and gender equality and corruption practices and telecommunication legislation. So, of course, it is a far more demanding, but ultimately also far, well, not necessarily far more, but immensely rewarding exercise of transforming society.
Good catch. Thank you for catching yourself on that one, Carl. Yes, thank you. Mircea, Geoana, is Romania backsliding? You heard what Alina had to say. Is that the country, Romania, where you are a politician?
I don't think we are moving backwards, but we are not moving forwards as fast as we should. So there is a big expectation of countries fully benefiting from fresh membership into the EU, structural funds, cohesion funds, and if you want, also the foreign investors' positive attitude towards a new member of the EU. So it's more complex, and also the politics of Romania are a little bit more paralyzed. But coming back to the question, I remember visiting Moscow in 2002, just after Romania joined NATO. And we were received by President Putin. And I have to say, probably he was, playing a little bit. But he didn't seem worried that much about Romania's NATO membership. But he was more concerned about Romania's EU membership, because there was clearly an economic competition between the ambition of Russia of coming back and getting influence back into Central Europe any way they can. And he seemed to me more concerned about the enlargement of the EU into Central Eastern Europe. So my point, and I think this is also what some of the key European nations have to decide about Ukraine, because this is the big piece we're discussing about. Is the place of Ukraine into the European Union in the foreseeable future or not? And I think this is the right question to ask in Berlin, this is the right question to ask in Paris, and to ask everywhere, because on the NATO side, things are, in terms of practicalities, a little bit easier if those countries want to join. So this is a big thing that we have not discussed in Europe, and we are fooling around for years and years, where are the limits of Europe? We're discussing about Turkey, we're not discussing about Ukraine, and I think this is the key question. The third thing, I was chairman of the OSCE in 2001 when we tried to rescue Macedonia with Lord Robertson and Javier Solana from the brink of civil war. And I have to say that I'm very much concerned about the capacity of the new states, recognized or not, in the Balkans to be able to perform accession into the EU. Not NATO that much, because we can eventually get those criteria performance-based a little bit easier. But I have my personal doubts that statelets of small dimensions, a little viability, and little cohesion would be able to really cope with a fantastic demand of acquis communautaire and the transformation of those societies. And here I think we have a big question mark. And if Afghanistan is the litmus test for the future of the credibility of NATO, the Balkan integration of all countries and all nations in the Balkans into the EU is the litmus test for Europe. And here I think we have a big problem. we have a big problem on our hands.
Morris, I'm going to come to you in a minute on Alina's question, but I want to go back to Carl. But Carl, I want to add something to what you can. Let me add something to the question, because at the bar last night, and the bar at a Brussels Forum conference is a very important place, there was a discussion of this new Eastern dimension of the EU, which was discussed at the Council meeting over the last 2 days. Is this what the EU needs to develop, in your view? And what could something like a new Eastern dimension to match the new Mediterranean outreach proposal look like? Are you talking about the same thing when Mircea talks about this?
Well, partly, but first answering that particular point, I think it's a very good point. I mean, you can ask yourself, how are these fairly small society states going to cope? And you can say, are they really ready for integration in the European Union? Very valid question. But you will also turn that argument around, and I would say, if not integrated, it's going to get worse. I mean, if you take a place called Kosovo, might have heard of it, I mean, absolutely monumental challenges of getting some sort of viable economy going there, and even building a functioning state, to be quite honest. That will not work without that being integrated into a firm regional framework, and that can only be provided over time by the European Union. This is going to be immensely difficult, but we have no choice. We are committed to the peace and prosperity of all of Europe, as we all say. So difficult it's going to be. Now, then coming to your question, I do think if you look at, again, from the EU enlargement point of view, there are three things that we need to do at the moment in terms of focusing the debate. One is that one that you mentioned, not coming only out of the bar, but coming out of discussions that we've had at the European Council and prior to that. When we've now launched this Union of the Mediterranean, which is essentially reinforced cooperation, Barcelona process plus turbo version of that, with the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. That's a good thing. That gives a strong political signal. What we need to do now is to do something, perhaps not similar, but something that sends the same signals towards the East, primarily Ukraine, potentially Belarus. It's not there, to put it in the mildest possible terms. Moldova as well. And offer them a new deal. We are on our way with Ukraine. We are discussing this enhanced agreement called Deep Free Trade, which goes quite far, very far, in terms of coordination of regulations and rules and energy legislation and transport infrastructure and things like that. That could be done into something, and that was discussed, although rather briefly, at the conclusion of the Council yesterday, I think it was. Then we need to do a new start in the Western Balkans. I think there are ways of leapfrogging that particular process, so we take them faster into, all of them more or less, into a more demanding stage of both assessment of their situation and implementation of the acquis. I'm not going to say they're going to be members very fast, but new start, leapfrog them into a new phase of it. And then Turkey is immensely important. We have a new situation. The new president of Cyprus is going to meet with Mr. Talat from northern Cyprus, the Turkish Cypriot leader, next week. This year might be the last chance of really overcoming the division of Cyprus. We need to invest a lot of political energies to support that process. It's primarily within the UN framework, but the EU countries and the US have a strong role to play. If we can move that forward and overcome at the same time the isolation of northern Cyprus, overcome the blockage that is the non-implementation of the Ankara Protocol, then we are in a new mood, also concerning Turkey and moving that forward, and that's also going to have vastly positive ramification for the issue that was discussed in the last session, that is EU-NATO cooperation, where we have problems ranging from Afghanistan, from Kabul to Mitrovica, to use one of these phrases. So these three things are possible. I mean, new Eastern deal, a new start and leapfrogging the Balkans, and then a lot of energies into overcoming the division of Cyprus. Then we might get into a new phase of enlargement of the EU. But, as I said, the quality requirements are going to be more strict than they were previously.
Several of my German colleagues and friends have raised their hands, so I want to give them the right to jump back in. Just to show that I'm politically balanced, Volker Stanzel, the political director for the German Foreign Office, gets the microphone before I give Eckert a chance to also respond to some of the questions directed at him. Volker, good to see you again.
Ron, you started by saying that on the podium there are only people who are pro-enlargement, and those who are against enlargement may be in the audience, and then you turned right away to the Germans here.
No, it's just a coincidence, you know?
Yes, I want to underline that it's a coincidence.
It's because you're so important.
Eckhard von Kleeden has clearly said that it's a question of when and not of if. And in the cases of Ukraine and Georgia and the question of map, he has given the two major reasons. But there's another aspect there that you have mentioned, which is the Russia factor. And I think, why should we avoid that? Why shouldn't we discuss the Russia factor? It's something that we need to discuss about. It's not of veto or not veto. It's the question of taking into regard the regional environment of a question like the enlargement to the east of NATO. Now, Russia is presently in the process of great internal changes and changes that also concern its foreign policy. With a new president there will be a new administration, and the impact of having a new administration presumably will be as great as it will be next year in the United States. Now, why do we have to insist on giving map to Ukraine and Georgia, apart from the two reasons that Eckhard von Kleeden has mentioned, at this point in time? Wouldn't it be better to try to figure out how to resolve, for example, the frozen conflicts with a new administration in Russia, and thus facilitate this process of integrating both Ukraine and Georgia on a longer timeline into NATO? And maybe if we're decreasing the tensions in the region by achieving that, the path until true membership will not be longer than if we start now at a point in time where we would, of course, increase conflicts with Russia. Is that really necessary? What's the point of insisting on this precise year for giving map to Ukraine and Georgia? Thank you.
Eckert, did he cover? Do you want to add here? Then we'll... Ralph, I'm going to come to you in a little bit here. Yeah.
Does it work? Or Oh, maybe two little points. First of all, the question from our Ukrainian colleague was where our reluctance comes from Yulia Tymoshenko's behavior. It was, I think, her visit in Brussels on January the 29th, where not only the Germans but also others thought that she was quite reluctant on the membership action plan idea. And our concern comes from the observation that Ukraine, and the polls are proof for that, has not really made up its decision in which direction the country wants to go. And I know both arguments, that on the one hand, what we all want, and I stress again, not if, when, that Ukraine comes closer to the West. But on the other hand, such a membership action plan also could encourage the opponents in your country to try to hinder it. And as I said, if we have what we also had, a country like Ukraine leaving the membership action plan again, this would hurt NATO very, very much. And regarding Georgia, I see this argument that regarding the frozen conflicts, this could offer Russia an indirect veto. And also, I agree with that. You can't use it in that way. But Volker Stanzel gave you one reason, and the other reason, of course, is that that the internal reforms in Georgia has to be improved. It is your opposition that says that the election of the president was not quite fair, and the OSCE also had some concerns regarding the elections. And I think in April or May you will have your parliamentary your elections to parliament. So let's see, and we encourage you to go on the way to democracy and rule of law. And as I said, not if but when. And you're right if you say the frozen conflicts cannot give Russia an indirect veto, but it's the mixture of several reasons.
Okay. Ralph, I'm going to come to you in a second. I'm first going to go to Mr. Grushenko, who is from Ukraine, but from the other side of the political aisle, the opposition. So we want to hear perhaps a voice from blue as opposed to orange, and then I'm going to come to Morris, and then I'm going to you, Ralph.
Well, thank you. I believe that there is very wide support for the idea that was aired by Geoana, that first, in this age, the membership or our movement toward integration into the EU should be the priority. It would open multitude of other opportunities, including internal debate about what next in the security area. For Ukraine, part of the dilemma is not only a multitude of reasons why we should not be in NATO in general. That's a rather large portion of population believes in. But if you even detract from that, get away from it, part of the reason for our eastern neighbors to join NATO first was that it was opening the path towards EU membership. Now we are hearing very clear and loud from Brussels, from the capitals, of total delinkage of these two issues. If you only have mostly obligations and being part of the security mechanism, of security structure, that now takes upon itself responsibility far away in Afghanistan, in other places, and you don't have a comparable asset that you could explain to your population that it would bring also to you the membership, which is widely supported of EU, to Ukrainian public, you don't have a case. Now, about this particular logic from the German side, I must say that for me personally, that was one reason why the government should not have sent this letter to NATO, because it provides an opportunity for those who don't wish to see Ukraine in NATO in any case to use the position of the opposing forces for their own reasons. We need to understand better whether essentially NATO and its members want to have Ukraine in NATO in general, because it was Ukraine that sent a brigade to Iraq. Our soldiers really served there on a scale that most of the members were not able to mobilize. We are participating in every joint operation with, including NATO, under the United Nations. We provide an input into security. We are not simply the consumers of security. Nonetheless, it's always as if Ukraine is begging to get in. There needs to be a strategic assessment, essentially, what the NATO member states and the United States really wishes, and not really to point to what is internal debate. Internally, we cannot move towards NATO when 53% at least is not supporting it after 16 years.
Okay.
You know, let me simply put one more point here. In 16 years, we had a change of generation, and still the level of support is very minimum. I believe that we need to work together with the current government to provide an opportunity to understand better what NATO is all about, and to have an open and free debate, and only then move forward. But still, the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian opposition will wait for response from Washington, from Paris, and from Germany. It will be interpreted, in any case, as a signal. How you expect Ukraine to be in 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mars Riekstins, this is the debate that presumably is taking place in the NATO Council. When you hear these arguments, do you think NATO has made up its mind on whether Ukraine should be a member?
Well, I can refer just to what Secretary General mentioned an hour ago, that we have some working days to go. But since there was a reference made to Latvia with connection to corruption, and I know that it's always very difficult to make a correction of technical errors in history books. Nevertheless, I would just like you to check your sources of information. Never idea of limiting or somehow interfering into practical matters of our corruption bureau in Latvia was considered at the level of government. That was not the case. Even more, I think we gave additional financial resources and means to that institution for this year in this year's budget. Few comments on the issues discussed here before. On enlargement fatigue. I think that one of the reasons why we are discussing this issue of enlargement fatigue is that the previous enlargement processes, they were mainly Eastern oriented. And we brought the countries into those two organizations from the east of Europe. And let's be frank, the information among the general public in the old member countries about the nations, about the culture of those countries is somewhat limited. I would love to see a debate on enlargement fatigue if, for instance, Sweden and Finland would like to decide that they are willing to join NATO alliance, which for me personally, given the fact or given the very active relations of those countries with NATO, doesn't seem completely crazy idea. But I would like to see that debate on enlargement fatigue if that will come to our agenda. On Russia, I think it's very important to start with a question: what is the point of departure for that issue? Is Russia interested in having in their neighborhood a stable, prosperous, and predictable countries? I think yes. Given the previous experience of previous enlargement rounds, and we have witnessed that those rounds have brought more stability, more prosperity to the countries involved, I think it ought to be in Russia's interest to have them anchored as soon as possible in Euro-Atlantic family.
Okay, we're going to bring in a Russian or two in a second, but first, Marc Grossman, do you think the United States has made up its mind? And can you tell Konstantin here and Gregory that there's a consensus in the U.S.? Okay, don't worry. First you, then Slava, then back there.
Yeah, I don't have any idea whether the United States has made up its mind. But I do think the reason I asked for the floor is I think, sir, you make a really important point that I'd like to reemphasize, which is the question of the public. And I think one of the reasons that publics in Ukraine, publics in other NATO countries, publics in the country, they don't support this alliance as much as they did anymore is because they have lost precisely what you said. People can't answer the question of what it's for and what's the purpose. And I think with all due respect, I know this is the North American accent, but people may be having that challenge with the European Union as well. And that's one of the reasons that the treaty was so difficult. And so I would just say that the conversation that we are having here this afternoon is very important. And all of the issues that we are talking about are extremely important. But we need to step back a little bit, I think, and raise our sights, because if we're to speak to all of our peoples about the next round of challenges, as the Secretary General did, they are about climate change and energy security and terrorism. And it seems to me, anyway, you can't solve those problems unless there's a strong NATO. You can't solve those problems unless there's a Europe whole, free, and at peace. You cannot solve those problems unless you're in some positive conversation, engagement with Russia. And so I say I don't say that anything we've talked about here today is not important. It's really very important. But I think in the larger context of what the future is it holds for all of us, we have to recommit ourselves to those issues and recognize that the institutions that we have are the answer to those questions. And that seems to me is how I would go back to the public in the United States, how you might consider talking to the public in Ukraine or all of the other countries represented here today.
Okay, we got lots of people that want to talk. Ralph, you've been patient. Then Slava. Then Lena Kosachev here.
Thanks,
see if I can remember it all. Okay.
Yeah.
No, Konstantin, yes.
I want to come
to Konstantin. Yeah.
I want to focus on the issue of EU enlargement. And I would say in terms of stability, prosperity, and democracy proportion, that's even more important than the NATO question. And the restricting factor here is not Russia. And it would only be half of the story if we would focus alone on the question if Turkey, Ukraine, and Georgia are ready to join the European Union, how far they fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, and so on and so forth. The other side of the story, and we should be frank and honest to ourselves, is the European Union capable for further integration of countries like Ukraine and Turkey and Georgia? And what will happen with the European Union if economic, social, cultural heterogeneity and differences within the Union will increase? Will that undermine coherence, and will that weaken solidarity within the European Union? And that is the hidden debate in Brussels and in other places. And I think we have to be clear that if we want enlargement of the European Union, if we want really the European Union go at the geographical borders of Europe, we will have to accept, I'm afraid, that it will be more a union of states and less a political union than we dreamed some years ago. But I think this is a crucial issue we have to debate on. And I would be interested what the two foreign ministers think about that.
Okay. Slava Nikonov.
Thank you. Russians were silent until now, probably because the initial notion is that we don't care what Russians have to say about it.
I was waiting for you to raise your hand.
We have our agenda. We are going ahead, so why listen to Russia? So, on the other hand, in Russia, we do not have debate on NATO enlargement because it is a consensus issue. We do consider it to be harmful to Russian national security and presenting probably existential threat to Russia. Well, of course, engagement from capital letter E is a great thing, but if you want to engage a country without discussing with it its existential challenges, I don't think it will go anywhere.
Well,
it looks very much like...
Just help us understand why you use the word existential and why you think...
Imagine a situation of conflict in South Ossetia. It's no easier to bring South Ossetia or Abkhazia back to Georgia than, say, Kosovo back to Serbia. And does that mean Article 5 situation? Does that mean a doomsday scenario? I don't think so. Actually, this is quite serious. This is about guarantees. This is about nuclear guarantees to the member states. And that is, I think, is quite serious. NATO expansion is here addressed to as astonishing strategic success. In my view, astonishing strategic success for Europe would be Russia as an ally. But what the NATO enlargement managed to achieve was a successful elimination of any pro-Western forces inside Russia. I don't know of any Russian politicians who would argue for NATO expansion. I think it was quite counterproductive for the long-term interests of Europe. NATO here was described as area of prosperity, extension of this area of prosperity, the enlargement process. But it's not just about prosperity. It's also about hardware. Actually, the deal on the first wave of enlargement was, let me remind you, was no nukes, no troops, no infrastructure. Fortunately, no nukes, but there are new troops. Romania, by the way.
We are the second wave.
Okay, but anyway. So something we agree on the first wave does not apply to the second wave? Okay, understandable. Critical infrastructure. national missile defenses in Poland, Czech Republic, these are components of nuclear deterrence. It's not just about expanding areas of prosperity. So I think it's a serious issue. Of course, the argument is these countries apply and these countries comply. Well, Georgia was downgraded after the recent political crisis and elections to countries with very problematic democratic development. Doesn't matter. Ukraine, most of the population doesn't matter. My friend Grigory found 25% of Ukrainians, and I don't know where to find them. I never saw a public opinion poll showing more than 20% of Ukrainians wanting to join NATO. The country doesn't want to. So maybe it's about something else, rather than expanding this area of prosperity or introducing the countries which want to join. In my mind, we should think bigger instead of considering that we did something which went well, which created no major international crisis. This is in the long-term interest of everybody. I think what is in the long-term interest of everybody is to create a non-divided community of nations in Europe, and Russia being the largest European nation. Thank you.
Lena, you're next.
Thank you very much. Could you tell me, please, where you see the enlargement fatigue? Because when you use that, I started to think. The Eurobarometer opinion polls show that there is a high support for European integration, and it's not decreasing since 15 years, and it has even increased in the last year. The economy of the new member states, most of them is doing extremely well. Economy of some Western countries has been doing very well because of as a result of the enlargement. The treaty crisis was not an effect direct, even if at all, of enlargement. So I'm curious, where do you find this enlargement fatigue before we start discussing about future enlargements? Second point is not if, but when. You know, if we can speak about enlargement fatigue, we can speak also about waiting fatigue or expectation fatigue. And it's very, very dangerous. And we had that facing in Poland. How long you can wait being promised every 2 years that, you will get in? Lack of date means a lack of date always mobilizes and has very important psychological effects on societies and on elites. Lack of date can be treated as lack of will, and the Turkey example is quoted very frequently in that context. There is a lack of date, and now we are not sure if Turkey will ever get into European Union. So the lack of date not only fatigues those who are for, but also mobilizes those who are against. And we don't know, while waiting, what can happen in the meantime. So I'm not saying that some things should happen immediately, but some dates and some plans should be set in. Thank you very much.
Okay, we only have like 10 or 12 minutes left. I'm going to come to a couple people, yes? So I'm going to ask you to be brief. Konstantin, I'm going to come to you next, but I want to ask you a question, and I want to respond to Slava. And we can have this debate tonight again at the bar. I was part of the NATO-Russia negotiating team that negotiated the NATO-Russia Final Act. There is nothing the United States has done that violates the terms of that agreement. And I just want to state that. We can talk about the details. There's a lot of people who were part of the negotiation in this room. I want to say I disagree with you on that. But I think the bigger question that a lot of us have who are part of this process is that when we look at Europe today, we think you have more stability on your western border than at any time in recent history. I often say at any time since Napoleon. So choose your date. There's more democracy, more stability, no prosperity. There is no Western threat to Russia coming from Europe or from NATO. And the one thing I think we have a very hard time understanding, and I think I agree with Volker, these are the things we need to have honest conversations about, is why you keep on coming back to, Konstantin, you said yesterday, you sat up here and said you want to be part of this bigger community. We see a Russia that is always invoking the enemy at the gate, and we're the enemy. And we think we've become much less of an enemy than ever before. But when I go to Moscow, and I will be the first one to say, I've been trying for 15 years to convince Russians that NATO enlargement isn't a threat, and I know I failed. I sometimes say I've convinced 5 Russians, maybe 6 on a good day. But why can't we get over this issue? Why is it that Slava here says existential threat, which frankly seems ludicrous to most of us? What do you say to that? But you got to be brief, and we'll have another session tonight because we only got 10 minutes. I apologize for that.
Thank you. To me, it's quite simple. I see here people being extremely happy about the ongoing process on enlargement and more countries becoming members of the club. And I do understand that emotion. The problem is that Russia is not a beneficiary of that ongoing process. It does not bring any good news to Russia because we are not the member of the club and we will not be the member of the club anytime in the future. And this is a great problem. Please do not expect of us to be happy about seeing more and more countries becoming members of a club where we do not belong and where we cannot influence the process, the decision-making process. My colleague from Romania cited Mr. Putin from the meeting of 2002, who seemed to be more concerned about the European Union enlargement. And I believe that was a true impression, but that impression is from the year of 2002, when Russia was mostly concerned about more than 10 countries accessing the European Union, and most of them traditional partners of our country. But that experience has been rather good. We have succeeded to come over the troubles which appeared, and I think that the European Union enlargement is not longer any big problem for us, while NATO enlargement still is. Because in case of NATO enlargement, in very many cases, we have seen that promises we were given before were never fulfilled, like the very theoretical promises from Mr. Gorbachev's time not to take into NATO the former Soviet Union states. I think that agreement existed more or less, and ending with the juridical legal commitment not to deploy substantial military forces in the new coming countries, and we know what is going on about Romania, Bulgaria, and some other countries. Now, speaking in more humanitarian terms, I will give you 2 small examples. Both of them are about Ukraine. One, we have 2 districts on our border, Rostov on our side, Lugansk on the Ukrainian side. 660 kilometers of border, which does not exist at all, but which will appear in case Ukraine becomes a member state of NATO. There, we have, for example, a town with a street which is called Friendship Street, with a railway going just in the middle of the street, and this is the border between Russia and Ukraine. This border is being crossed every day by 3,000 Russian citizens going on the Ukrainian side and 6,500 people crossing that border each day from the Ukrainian side going for jobs in Russia. In case we do not address that type of problems, in case we will continue to have a discussion on that just in geopolitical terms, I think we may harm interests of both Ukraine and Russia. And the second fact, just small second fact, I cannot confirm that because I've read it in mass media, but I think that the real situation is not far from that fact. I read that Russia is capable to produce just 17% of its military production without any kind of cooperation with Ukraine. And I think the same goes for Ukraine, because our military industries are extremely much interrelated. So possible membership of Ukraine in NATO will definitely have very practical consequences for Russian economy and for Ukrainian economy.
Okay, thank you. We're down to 30 seconds. Marcus, can you ask your question in 30 seconds? Okay. Kestis, 30 seconds?
Honest man.
Okay. Back row, microphone. Constantine? Okay. Heather, 30 seconds? Okay. Then we come back briefly. Go ahead.
Kęstutis Jankauskas, Lithuanian representative in the PSC here. With all regard to Russia, we should listen, but it's our decision. It was for us, and I believe it will be for countries waiting. No veto. In that, to remark to the German colleagues, when they talk about the lack of deficit or lack of democracy in Georgia or the numbers on Ukraine, 2 remarks. For us, when we got the membership action plan in '99, in which we remained for 5 years, this membership action plan has 5 areas. It's democracy, rule of law, economy, quality of your military, transparency of military expenditures, and handling of classified information. All of that, together with European
You're
acquis,
over 30 seconds.
helped us to get better in our democracy. I think that is the reason why we should hand this membership action plans to Georgia and Ukraine.
Great.
As well as we get closer to NATO, numbers increased in public opinion, not diminished.
Thank you. Heather Grabi.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the panel to reflect on the impact of the enlargement on the functioning and the ambitions of NATO and the EU. We haven't really talked about what's happened to these organisations. Now, there's not really time to go into it, but there were a lot of predictions that there would be institutional gridlock, impossible to take decisions, new and old members splitting over the US, splitting over Russia, impossible for ambitious new projects to come to the fore. Has any of that really happened? And in both cases, would in fact the prospective new members actually cause gridlock?
Great. 15 seconds, Gregory. Yell so you don't need here's a microphone.
Look, this is a real values test, because what we've been told, there is a lack of democracy in Ukraine. For 3 last years, there were 3 elections in Ukraine. In all 3, it was the opposition who won. Now we have a democratically elected government who for the first time take a courage to say that we do want to join. So this is the test for the values.
Great.
And that's the answer should be based on the values and the sober calculation. And we're ready to be engaged with the Russian friends and with Germany, whoever wants to do the sober calculation, to decide when it would be better. But again, this is the clear answer. It's not Malta that's in and out. You know, Malta was in and out with the EU. Malta now is a member of the European Union.
Thank you. Any burning need for any closing remarks? Otherwise, I'm going to hand it to Craig Kennedy, who's been looking at me for 5 minutes saying, end it.
So we cannot remain silent on this subject.
Okay, briefly.
Very briefly on the question, which is on the enlargement debate on the EU, is a wider one, a looser one, and a weaker one, because that's really the core of the debate. And Heather's question really provides me with an answer. The 27 has not produced gridlock. It works extremely well. Those of us who sit around the council table every month, and sometimes more frequently than that, knows that if there are dividing lines, and sometimes there are, they're not sort of there's a core that wants to jump forward with political union. On the contrary, I mean, the most acrimonious debate that I've encountered during the last 2 years, which was really on the verge of fist fighting, was between the Benelux countries. And yeah, quite. It had its entertainment value, I can tell you. So the dividing lines aren't those. And also, if you look at the history of the Union, as long as it was only 6, it couldn't even decide on implementing the Rome Treaty provisions of majority voting. It was blocked by the French veto, the Luxembourg Compromise. It was only enlargement that facilitated the institutional evolution that we now see culminating in the Lisbon Treaty. And I would even argue that the union of the 27 works distinctly better than, say, the union of the 12 or the 15 that I was able to observe in the mid-90s. Distinctly better. Add to that it is a greater weight on the global scale. We are 500 million people. We are the by far largest integrated economy in the world. We are the largest trading power. We are bigger than the number 2 and the number 3 taken together. There's a currency, you might have heard of, the euro, that you can compare with the dollar, for example. That is not an insignificant and not a weak currency. So
thank you, Carl.
It's a stronger union and a better union.
Great. Briefly, Mircea.
what I will try to basically to say is that we have something to offer to Russia in terms of the West. And this is not about small pieces of territory here and there. It's about the global strategic architecture. And I think this is what will happen. The E, capital E, is about nuclear stuff. It's about many other things, missile defense, and things in common that we need to do in the 21st century.
Thank you.
The second point is, do not. I would really encourage our Russian friends, and I say friends, not to fall into the illusion that enlargement will not continue, because it will. Because this is the sense of history. And the third, and probably Transnistria will be probably even more interesting than Ossetia or Abkhazia in that context. And thirdly, if you overplay your energy card, we might be seeing Azerbaijan member of NATO sooner than you expect.
Morris, see if you could match that, you know?
Well,
quiet, please. We have to wrap up. Yeah.
Well, I think that this was one of the most interesting debates I participated in the last couple of months on this particular subject. And I think that we see clearly here that there are still some issues we have to sort out, also about the membership action plan. I think still some people here in this room believe that MAP, this is about the guarantee for membership, which is not. As you see with Albania, Croatia, and Macedonia, it took, well, if the decision in Bucharest will be positive, it took 9 years for them to go through that process. So, and I think that we have time for us in the future, in the coming years, to have these discussions with Russian participation, with Ukrainian, European, American, and thanks to JMF for organizing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Grossman.
I just have 3 quick points. One is that I think it's really important to emphasize that has gone through this whole debate about no veto. Second, I was asked the other day whether, in this debate about enlargement, whether I was sorry, even with all the imperfections that we had proceeded with the NATO expansion that we had. And I must say, I'm not sorry. And the person went on to then ask me, well, why do I think I'd be sorry in the future about this next round of expansion? I don't think I would. Third point is, and I'm sorry to be boring about this subject, but I very, very, very much respect the debate that we've had here today, but it could go on forever. And I think if you listen to the points that Mr. Kushner made yesterday and Mr. Duhub-Skeffer made today, that is part of the answer and the way out of this debate. Because if we would lift our sights to some of the future challenges that we would have, I think it would answer some of the questions about enlargement for what, and enlargement to whom, and enlargement with whom. And I think that's a point that I hope people will take away.
Thank you. Join me in a round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you, Ron.
Some of us will be at the bar tonight to continue the discussion, but...
as the Secretary General mentioned, in 2006, we did something like this before the NATO summit in Riga. And out of that, we developed a really great partnership with the government of Latvia. And we were looking for something to highlight that partnership. And when you go outside, there are wonderful cookies and other things from Latvia that you're going to really like. And then we'll see you back here at 6:30 for a really excellent panel on competitiveness and the economy. So we'll see you back in a half hour. Thank you. Thank all of you. That was good. Thank you. A real blooded sweet. Thank you, Craig. Getting a little nervous about it.
Hey, Constantine.
Yeah, it's a bloody good question.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Thank you.
And your point is right, too. There's no enlargement fatigue when Sweden and Finland want to join.
Sorry, I didn't want to have 3 Germans in a row.
Exactly right. There's no
I'm just trying to, because I knew you had a different angle. I knew you weren't going to talk about Russia. I said, what point is he going to raise? It won't be Russia. No, okay. Hey. That was good. That was fun.
No.
All right. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question.
Let me take this off.
They would like to.
All right. I'm on.
Okay, then we can do that. No, I haven't.
Hey, how are you? Just like,